Hello, friends. This is Waylon Lewis of Elephant Journal, and we do a just about weekly interview or conversation series. Today, I'm honored to host Andy Karr, a Buddhist teacher who I actually grew up knowing, and vice versa. And we're going to talk about his new book, Into the Mirror. Andy,
Hey, Waylon.
we did.
Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. So, Andy, if you would, do you have a copy of your book there?
I do.
Right. Yeah. Hold it up for us nice and close if you can. So it's Into the Mirror. So what is this book about and why were you inspired to go through the glorious and awful toil that is writing and publishing a book?
Well, I do like writing. It's challenging, but I wouldn't say that it was awful.
Oh, good.
Um, there were a couple of reasons I wrote it. The I've been concerned for a long time about how Buddhism is meeting the modern world, and felt that there were some real issues that we weren't dealing with very well, and particularly with the materialism of the modern world, that we were bringing a lot of materialistic assumptions with us when we became Buddhists that were, I think, obstructive, that hinder our progress on the path.
And by
And
materialism, you're not just talking about wanting things and money and all that.
that's kind of the top level. That's the most superficial level of materialism. But materialism is basically the belief that anything that's real is physical. Anything that's real is material.
Mm.
And that puts the mind in a real secondary or almost dismissive or illusory position. So we get really confused about the causes of suffering and the causes of happiness and the causes of bondage and the causes of liberation.
So from a Buddhist point of view, what are those causes? Because they are complex. Like in reality, obviously not being able to pay your rent or afford food is a part of suffering and of reality for many people.
Well, I think it's helpful to distinguish pain from suffering,
Mm.
and um, bondage and liberation are a whole further level of suffering.
But that kind of liberation, the path of the Buddha isn't just for the privileged, right? It's for all of us.
I hope so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think privilege get any special claim to liberation or freedom from suffering.
Yeah. But yeah. So tell me so what is the theme of Into the Mirror in terms of how to relate to that materialism that we're all kind of in?
Well, so a big chunk of it is examining the assumptions we have about the mind and about is an assumption that I think is so deeply ingrained that our brains are a dominant element of our reality. And that's funny because we never actually experience our brains. We think about our brains, but that thinking is mental. And so, our notion of the brain and the mind can be quite distorted, that we think that our minds are dominated by our brains in a way that isn't really the case.
So you're kind of saying like we're caught up in the neurosis or the thing. We're caught up in the neurosis or the thinking without actually being able to discern between being present and having that obsessive kind of
Well,
neurotic.
yeah, it's actually, it's a narrative that we carry with us, a narrative about our experience, that what we're experiencing is caused by our brains and our bodies.
Yeah.
And, that narrative is limiting because if we really want to deal with the causes of suffering and the causes of bondage, we have to look directly at our minds, not at our brains.
Mhm.
If you're looking looking at your brain, you'll say, okay, well, probably I need to take some pharmaceutical to fix it,
Mhm.
or some illegal drug, or whatever it is. Because my suffering is coming from a material basis, I need some material basis to counteract.
Yeah.
And that prevents us sometimes from really looking at what is going on in our experience, and starting to recognize how it is our experience and our relationship to it that is the problem.
And so that, I mean, that sounds, you know, really mature and philosophical when it comes out of your mouth. But if I repeated that, I said, look, people don't need drugs, legal or otherwise, necessarily. Sometimes it can be helpful. But what you really need is X, which is, I'm assuming, meditation, study, the Buddhist path of relating.
Ethics,
Was that
ethics.
ethics relating to suffering directly?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty controversial statement, which is kind of exciting in different book sense.
Well, I don't know about that, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think sometimes I'm not going to dismiss pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
There are cases where people have these imbalances that do require pharmaceuticals.
Sure.
But I think, that there's a dominant narrative in society that it's all about stuff. Either
Yeah.
stuff to accumulate, knowledge as stuff, um, whatever it is that you think is the cause of happiness.
Yeah.
And what happens is not that these things are bad, but that the ignorance of what's happening in your mind when you crave these things is binding you, and deceiving you. You have this thought, or this projection, or this vision of paints, and um, and we spend all our time chasing after these reflections, or running away from reflections if we're fearful, and we're caught up in this.
Yeah.
and and the reflections are never going to be satisfactory.
No.
On the simplest level, if you think a new phone is going to make you happy, you get it. There's the moment of joy because you have the feeling of possession. And then a week later, it's not a new phone anymore. And then 6 months later, the next one comes out. All of that is a deception based on the initial belief that your projection of this thing was going to provide happiness.
Right. And the opposite too, Andy, right? Like, we're not noticing in a funny way that the thoughts and the neurosis are keeping us miserable.
Absolutely.
We think we figure it out. We think the problem is whatever I'm thinking about instead of the thought,
Yeah.
kind of.
Yeah. So the title of the book I find interesting, first of all, because I didn't understand it first.
Into
Shambhala, when they're publishing a book, they have a committee that reviews titles. And I had come up with 3 or 4 really crappy titles over the course of writing this book. And then they came up with a bunch of crappy titles. And the committee was meeting one day about a year ago, and my editor said, we have to come up with some better options. And I woke up the morning the committee was meeting and thought, into the mirror. And I thought, oh, that sounds cool.
Yeah.
Lewis Carroll,
Yeah.
working class, kind of literary. And it took me about a year to realize that there was some meaning to Into the Mirror that I had neglected, which is that the book is very much about the relationship we have to all these reflections. The ultimate antidote is to look at the mirror itself, the mind, which is the mirror of our experience.
Hmm. So in a like everyday advice way, if someone comes to you who is, reading your book or is about to read your book and they say, so what do I do? Do I look at my mind? Like, what is the basic advice beyond reading the book, of course?
Yeah, so I take it in steps.
Yeah.
The book has three main parts. The first one is a general orientation toward meditation practice, toward working with your feeling, experiencing your feelings rather than thinking about them,
Mm,
um, distinguishing what we perceive from what we think, what we project.
mm.
And Elephant um, printed or published a very nice, I think, very nice extract from the book about that kind of distinguishing, how to distinguish perception from conception.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll include that excerpt when we release the video of the podcast as
Great,
well. Yeah.
great. Anyhow, so that's the first stage of the book. It's kind of assembling your resources for the journey. And then the second part of the book is about materialism. And it takes a Western philosophical axe to this notion that the mind comes from the brain,
Right.
that the mind is is not a real thing, and that the brain is. So, using some Western philosophy to cut through a lot of the narrative we inherit about materialism and
Mm.
stuff. And so that's the second part. And that's kind of the preparation for the big ascent in the third part, the big climb, which is going through the Mahayana path and using some of the methods that were developed, particularly by the Indians, the early Indian Mahayanas, about how to recognize how we project onto reality all the time, how we fabricate, and then to look at the kind of essence of that fabricating mind.
Mm.
So, I think the simple prescription is you need some tools, you need some methods, you need to eliminate some effective assumptions, and then you need to explore. You need to investigate, and you use the methods that were presented at the beginning of the book and first part to actually look at mind directly.
Yeah. So Mahayana, if you can you unpack what Mahayana is for some of us?
Sure,
Right.
sure. So Mahayana Buddhism, um, we distinguish an early Buddhism from the time of the Buddha. Little we know historically of the time of the Buddha. There's earliest forms of Buddhism which emphasize um, virtue and non-virtue and taming your mind. And, and they started to develop various ways of analyzing the mind and analyzing experience and deepening their understanding of reality. And then around the turn of the millennium, about 500 years after the time of Buddha, some people started to take this further and criticize some of the early Buddhist thinking as not going far enough, not going deep enough, and not seeing how the mind itself was empty of any of the reality we ascribe to it, and that um, our tendencies to project onto our experience some solidity, some permanence, was a big problem. It's freezing our reality all the time, things in it, rather than being able to go along with the flow of that reality.
Mm.
And then further, they started to talk about the basic sense of duality that we experience all the time, the sense of separateness, um, that we're not able to really relax ultimately, and that duality is itself false, and we presented methods to see through that duality. And then the Mahayana culminates with this notion of Buddha nature, which is the sense that we already have minds that are perfect, but we don't know how to relate to them. We don't know how to work with them. We don't know how to experience them. So there's ignorance that's covering over this perfection. And so the purpose of the path is not to become some super person or to gain something that you don't already have, but it's about recognition and eliminating the confusion that's covering over this wisdom. And so that that's the Mahayana path, and I think it developed quite organically in India. I think it was not some revolution that was tearing down the earlier Buddhism,
Right.
But it was just going further, and people were developing ways of teaching and thinking about reality that were more and more profound.
And from the outside in, I grew up, as I mentioned in the beginning, in the same Buddhist community. But if I were just hearing this for the first time, I'd say, well, this sounds like a really interesting, kind of cool philosophical path, and I need to read a bunch of books. But it's not just philosophy, right? What makes it different?
Yeah, it's absolutely not just philosophy. Philosophy's helpful.
Yeah.
It's helpful because we already have a lot of hidden philosophy that we carry around with us.
Right. The assumption you were mentioning.
A lot of assumptions about how things are.
Yeah.
So the philosophy purpose of it is mainly to surface the assumptions that we carry and mostly to undermine them, to cut through them. So,
interesting. Yeah.
So that's one part. More important or equally important is how to work directly with your experience. So not just think about it and understand it, but how to be with your experience. And that's what we call meditation.
Thanks for listening. Hope you're getting a lot out of it. The full conversation is on our indie platform that supports and continues our work, elephantjournal.com/videos. You can subscribe, listen, watch, and participate there. And when you do so, you'll keep these mindful videos and podcasts going. elephantjournal.com/videos. May it be of benefit.